Hello, I'm Nance Haxton, and this is the Griffith University podcast, A Middle Ground. A Middle Ground provides independent analysis by Australia's best political scientists and policy researchers. It's a sad fact of Australian life that every 2 minutes, police are called to a family violence matter. Every week, a woman is murdered violently by a current or former partner. Natasha Stott-Despoja describes this as Australia's national emergency. The former senator and leader of the Democrats says societal attitudes underpin this, with international evidence showing that high levels of domestic violence are rooted in attitudes that disrespect women and see women as inferior. Part of this problem, she believes, is that behavioural standards in federal parliament have diminished, with attitudes towards women not improving in the nearly 25 years since she was first voted into the Senate. Natasha Stott-Despoja tells me in this exclusive interview for A Middle Ground that critical mass is not enough and gender parity is the heart of the solution. She's now the founding chair of Our Watch, the national organisation to prevent violence against women and their children. I spoke to Natasha straight after her International Women's Day address at the World Music Festival, WOMADelaide. Natasha Stott-Despoja, thank you so much for joining us on A Middle Ground today.
It's a pleasure to be with you and to see you again, Nance. If you watched the sunset on International Women's Day 2019, it was a great opportunity to talk about not just the gains we've made, and we should celebrate and commemorate the gains that we've made in gender equality over decades, if not centuries, but it's also an opportunity to look at some of the challenges that confront us. And obviously, I referred to a couple of key ones, including the high rates of violence against women and children, and of course, the lack of representation of women in our parliaments.
You spoke of looking back as well, some of the frustrations that you faced. Of course, you say you're still being introduced as the youngest woman that entered the halls of Parliament House, so that's got its frustrations at times.
Look, I do embrace it, to be honest. I'm proud of that legacy, but I've always said I'll be excited, when we see the next youngest woman to ever enter the Parliament. But certainly I've had the chance to reflect on some of the ridiculous stereotypes and double standards that I was subjected to. But also, I just think we really lack diversity and difference in our parliaments generally, but we need more women specifically in our all decision-making institutions, but Parliament especially.
Particularly, some of the headlines focus more on your feminine characteristics than your policies.
You mean I'm blonde? Certainly references to age, appearance, even footwear. And I, obviously joke that you can't believe that any women would these days be referred to in public life by their footwear, but okay, I see that hasn't changed.
Well, and that does lead us to, have you noticed much change in these 2 and a bit decades? What has progressed for women in politics? What frustrates you still?
I think generally there's been a diminution in behavioural standards. Having said that, things have changed, and I don't want to discount progress, and certainly political parties have increased in the main their representation, particularly the Labor Party. Liberal Party has been woeful, particularly in recent elections, but I honestly didn't think in 24 years since I first entered Parliament that we'd actually seen a decline during some modern electoral cycles in women's representation. So, progress in terms of how we view politicians, our expectations of what constitutes a politician. I mean, when I got in, people just didn't think relatively younger people or women should be in Parliament. So that gap has been breached in some respects. But yeah, the fact that we're only around, 32% representation of women in federal politics and Parliament, that is shameful.
And you mentioned even some other countries in your speech who are developing nations who are ahead of us on that.
Seriously, we are now 50th in the world according to the Interparliamentary Union. I mean, we're behind New Zealand by 31 places. I mean, how does that happen? So we certainly have a lot to make up for. And I think it can be done, but we just need the political goodwill, the commitment from politicians, and indeed all those men who are scurrying out the parliamentary doors right now. Why are they not being represented by women? Why are they not being replaced by the talented women that we know are out there?
Is this a problem? We've seen a lot of focus on Liberals' difficulty with encouraging women. Perhaps is it just limited to the Liberal Party in this modern era?
that's complex in terms of some of the attitudes to women in positions of power are across the board. And of course, let's look at business and industry or the ASX 200 top companies. Very few women in those positions, women in defence personnel positions. It's not just politics, but certainly when it does come to Parliament, there is a very clear distinction now. There is no question that women in the Liberal Party who have been in positions of power are either leaving or not being promoted, and certainly men in the Liberal Party who are leaving Parliament are, in the main, being replaced by men.
And you spoke of really there's economic reasons as well as ethical reasons for gender equity in Parliament.
Oh, look, the research is pretty clear. As they say, the jury is out. There's no question. You increase a nation's economic growth if you get greater participation rates of women in the workforce, generally. We also know that if you solve issues that affect women, like, say, violence against women, in Australia, you probably save around $21 billion a year, by 2021-22. So this is an issue that has economic issues that's associated with it, but in the main, it's also fair. It's also about human rights, and surely we want a fair, equal, safer, respectful society.
Congratulations also, Natasha, for writing on violence that was released this week. You mentioned in your speech that this was a great achievement, but also one that you're quite sad about in a way. It's the most stark evidence of the gender inequality that women still face.
Look, the issue of violence against women and children in Australia, when you have a woman dying on average every week, you have 1 in 4 women over the age of 15 experiencing some form of physical or sexual abuse in their lifetime. That is a pretty poor indicator of gender progress and gender equality. It's really an essay, just an essay that I've written, and I hope that it's digestible, readable, and it actually gives people pointers for how we can prevent violence. So my focus is entirely primary prevention, and it's about, addressing those attitudes and behaviours that give rise to violence in the first place. So I hope people will read it, but people who are specialists and people in the sector, they know this stuff. I find there are so many people, ordinary Australians, come up to me every day and say, what can I do? So this is my attempt to show people what maybe you could do.
The statistics are pretty damning. You describe it as a crisis in Australia. What gives you hope?
I'm hopeful because I know that violence is preventable. I know it's not an innate part of the, biological condition or makeup of people. I know that we've seen progress in places where you do address attitudes and behaviours. I know that if you have countries where gender equality is greater, the rates of violence against women and children decrease. But I also feel that there's momentum for change right now. I feel the community is sick of the death toll. They're sickened by the statistics. They want change. So that gives me hope. I just want it to happen a little faster than it's happening.
I know from my point of view, and I say this to my students at Griffith, I've noticed even in the time that I've been reporting for a couple of decades that when I started, editors were very open about, no, we don't do stories on domestics when you did the police beat. And I reckon it changed when Rosie Batty started. I could feel that movement then. Would you agree, or what do you think has led to that momentum?
Oh, look, entirely. Her contribution to this debate can never be underestimated. She did more than any other single person in contemporary times to put the issue of domestic and family violence in particular, but sexual assault as well, on the national stage, on the political map. I never underestimate Rosie Batty's contribution to these issues. You know that women like my mother, a journalist from, days in South Australia and elsewhere.
Stott-Despoja, quite a legend.
She is, and she, I used to go around women's shelters with her when I was a teenager, meeting women who work day in, day out to keep women and children safe, and she would write articles, and sometimes they were published, and more often they were not. But, there is a line of progressive women and men who've worked to put these issues into the media sphere and more broadly. But yes, I will always acknowledge the work of Rosie Batty, who built on generations of work by certainly the feminist and women's movements.
And she's written a fantastic quote on the front of your book, which I will read, Natasha. Violence is preventable, and this passionately written and very important book compels us to take action, challenge ourselves, and do so much more to stop this global pandemic. Thank you so much for contributing to this debate. Just to finish, I suppose we really should mention Me Too. Where did Me Too play in this? You've been in this ambassadorial role for 5 years. Did that also add to this debate?
Look, I was honoured to be Ambassador for Women and Girls between 2013 and 2016. I certainly had very much a global perspective in that role, and then came home to do my national work at Our Watch. Me Too, Let Her Speak, Time's Up, all these movements are part of momentum. They're momentum for change, and we should celebrate them and what they mean for women. Just as, Nance, we celebrate women like you, who you've had your own pioneering role in the mainstream media, and I commend you for that and the way that you've supported other women. That will never go unnoticed. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. That was former Senator Natasha Stott-Despoja, AM, now founding chair of Our Watch. This is the Griffith University podcast, A Middle Ground, where the great political debates take place. He's the son of a coal miner who has risen to become the head of one of the world's most well-known environmental organisations. David Ritter is the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific. In this latest edition of Griffith Review, called Writing the Country, David Ritter examines how the community of Margaret River has taken on the might of the coal industry. He tells me in this interview that this area's plight has great significance for the nation as we grapple with how much of a place coal has in our future. He urges us all to think beyond the left and right political divide when it comes to conservation, and instead demand more of our political leaders, regardless of their party allegiance. David, thank you so much for joining us on A Middle Ground.
Oh, it's a great pleasure. Thanks for having me.
And of course, you've written so much for Griffith Review over the years, including in the most recent edition, and you'll be visiting Griffith University to speak about that as well.
Yeah, I'll be up there this week. Look, a big shout out to the Griffith Review. I think in a media landscape that's dominated by a small range of interests, the Griffith Review does an amazing job in putting all sorts of work out there that otherwise wouldn't get an audience. And I think it's had some amazing pieces. I'm not talking about my own contribution, but some really amazing pieces over the years that have meaningfully shifted public debate.
And I really think, you've written on such a range of issues as well, from fishing and biodiversity to, so it's really interesting to see it now come back to coal, and of course your latest book, there's the intersection there, The Coal Truth. Can you tell us a bit about that? Yeah,
so the publisher, which was terrific, UWA Publishing, and I sort of sat down and talked about how to construct a book about this scandal of the potential mining of the Galilee Basin and the catastrophe that would be for the Great Barrier Reef, for the Queensland community, for the global climate and so on. And we just felt that having a chorus of voices in there, as well as my voice, would make for a much more rich and powerful book. And so I'm really, delighted that the very first chapter is by Adrian Burugubba, talking about the unique experience of the Wangan and Jagalingou peoples and their tenacious fight with the Adani company. There's a wonderful forward that I still can't read without the hairs standing up, from Bernd Selheim and Tara Moss, both very gifted writers, and it's their first ever joint piece. And then at the end of the book, there are a number of really eminent experts who've just sort of laid down an evidentiary barrage, talking about why we have to move beyond coal from a public health perspective, from a climate perspective, from an economic perspective, from a biodiversity perspective, wrapping up with a final really wonderful chapter by Ritter Talukdar, talking about how coal also doesn't work from a development perspective.
And I think of some of the points that you've just made in your speech just now as well, that Greenpeace commissioned independent polling only a week ago that showed that climate change is the number one concern for the electorate. Did that surprise you?
Look, it unfortunately didn't surprise me, because we'd seen such a range of consequences fall on our country, on our people over the last few months, that you just had the sense that things were shifting. Forests burning that shouldn't burn, reefs bleaching that shouldn't bleach, rivers drying up that shouldn't be dry, and then the consequences for individual lives. I mean, One of the stories I tell in The Cold Truth is the story of a woman who has a pre-existing health condition who dies alone in her flat in Sydney's inner west in the middle of a record heat wave. Now, this is adding up. This sense that things have to change, that we have reached a moment of when the crisis is breaking on us. That is why we are now seeing an electoral mood that says we must have action on climate change, why it's now the number one issue.
And is that what you're looking at in your most recent article for Griffith Review as well, in Margaret?
Well, look, in a sense, the most recent piece for Griffith, called We All Took a Stand, is almost like the missing West Australian chapter from The Cold Truth, and it narrates the story of the remarkable stand taken by the Margaret River community to defeat proposals to build a coal mine in the heart of Margaret River country. And it was really interesting because this was a huge success for what you would ordinarily call the environment movement, but there were some fairly unusual actors involved there. But it was almost like it was regarded as such an anomaly because Margaret River is this iconic place that people sort of saw it as the exception. Now I think that's not the right interpretation, because what happened here is a community that in many ways is quite conservative stood up and said, there are some things more important than coal, and we can't believe what the companies are telling us. Now, the moment that watershed has been reached of saying some things are more important than coal, and you can't believe what the companies are telling us, it's very difficult to put that genie back in the bottle. So I really wanted to tell that story.
Because I must admit, I was wondering that as you were speaking today. Is it easier to speak about this, dare I say, in somewhere like Adelaide, but that perhaps a bit removed from the implications of coal mining? You mentioned the Hunter Valley, the massive job losses that community is facing. How do you reconcile that? How do we transition from this coal economy?
Well, look, for any of your listeners, I'd love to get an invitation to go and talk anywhere. Again, one of the stories in the book is the story of my dad's first job, and my dad's first job was as a coal miner. My parents were post-Depression era kids. There was an ethic around the nobility of coal mining that was in my family when I grew up. In a sense, we're all part of the coal industry because we all belong to a society that has been built on industrialisation that was built on coal. So what we have to do as a country is not treat the industry or the communities that have built the industry as enemies, but as part of a family that we need to shift into doing something else for the great good of all of us. And we've done this kind of stuff before. As a country, we are really, really good at these sorts of transitions. In the 20th century, we twice transitioned to fight wars. We once transitioned, whatever one thinks of it, we transitioned to make the reforms to our economy in the 1980s. We transitioned to enable full participation of women in the workforce, which is not to say we're there yet with the gender pay gap and so on, but nevertheless, we made that structural change. We are perfectly capable of making the kind of transition, the structural transition we need to, in a way that doesn't leave workers behind, that doesn't leave communities behind. I mean, actually what we need, to use a phrase borrowed from a brilliant writer, Frances Flanagan, who also happens to be my spouse, we need a new work order in Australia.
Is the renewable industry ready for this huge transition though?
I think the renewable industry is ready to explode. And I think actually there is a frustrated creativity in this country of people who are desperate to work in exciting and meaningful jobs, who are, wanting to create new things, test new things. I'm aware of one case of a bloke who graduated with first-class honours in engineering from university in my home state. All he wanted to do was work in renewable engineering. It's all he wanted to do. But because of the regulatory environment, the jobs weren't there. If we create the regulatory environment, if we create the right investment, the renewables industry will explode. And by the way, it is not just renewables industry, it is regenerative agriculture, it is the sort of transitions that we need to make in our buildings, in our transport. I mean, there's a tendency sometimes to be gloomy about all of this, like, coming off coal will be a terrible thing. Well, it will create real challenges for people who are directly engaged in that industry. There is no doubt, and we shouldn't underplay those. But for us as a society and as a nation, we can engage with this with kindness and with creativity and with imagination and emerge from it a bigger country than we are now.
So coming up to this federal election, do you hear any of the political parties espousing this, really discussing this? If this is such a big issue for Australian people, who is really talking about this?
Well, I think when it comes to our two major parties, there is an enormous gap between their offering and what the people of Australia want on a whole range of things. People of Australia, according to all the polls, want investment in health and education, and they love nature, and they love their ABC, and they want their CSIRO and their universities to be independent, and they want an end to single-use plastics on their beaches, and they are sick and tired of money being ploughed into things like coal mines and, the potential for drilling oil in the Great Australian Bight, for goodness sake, at depths deeper than Deepwater Horizon. And people want action on climate change, and they want politicians who are free from vested interest, have an ethic of public service, and are prepared to lead in ways that involve them explaining difficult things and sticking to the task. And I think all of us, we citizens of Australia, we just keep having to ask for more from our politicians, and we have to be putting our energy into reforming the system so that we get better politicians, and those who are there now in Parliament and who are frustrated by the system as it is are actually freed and enabled to be their better selves.
And you did have a note of optimism in the speech that I noticed. You mentioned electoral politics is compromised but not redundant. Do you think that is the case here? Do we have hope that our politicians, that our major political parties can listen more to these issues that are so important to Australian people?
Well, so the only reason why the Queensland government walked back from some what was essentially free money around Adani was because of the power of people. The only reason why there was a Banking Royal Commission was because of the pressure put on by people. The reason why we now have a Royal Commission into disability services is because of the power of people. We can make a difference when we are organised and we exercise our power and our determination, and it does still also apply to electoral politics. And I would just encourage people everywhere to get involved, join whichever party more closely matches your values, and demand something from that party. And if none of the parties do, we'll go and organise a Cathy McGowan or a Kerryn Phelps. It is up to us to do the work that is necessary to put some people in Canberra that we can all be proud of. So
it's not just a right or left issue, and people who'd like to make that conservation is just for the lefties. It's not as simple and partisan as that?
Absolutely not. I mean, in Australia, Malcolm Fraser turned the Great Barrier Reef into a marine park. Sir Garfield Barwick was an early patron of the Australian Conservation Foundation. There is in both liberalism and conservatism a deep set of ideological roots that could give you a perfectly well-formed flourishing environmentalism, which would be different to an environmentalism of the kind that you would have if you were a social democrat. But the argument that we should be having is about how we protect nature to the best of our abilities, not denying the evidence of our own eyes and our own bodies, which is where we are at the moment.
That was David Ritter, the CEO of Greenpeace Australia Pacific, speaking to me after his feature Planet Talk speech at WOMADelaide. And that wraps up this episode of A Middle Ground. You can follow and subscribe to this Griffith University podcast on your podcast provider, iTunes or SoundCloud.